during World War I, during this nationalistic period, with the exclusion of the French language on school grounds, punishing kids, humiliating kids, forcing them into a position where the first few weeks of school they had to wet their pants every day because they didn't know how to ask for permission to go to the bathroom in English, and they weren't allowed to ask in French. And a language that causes you to humiliate yourself in that way, causes you to be punished, write 1,000 times, I will not speak French on the school grounds, wear a sign that, you know, calling attention to yourself as a fool. You want to distance yourself from that language as fast as possible. But then the same generation finds themselves fighting World War II. And many of them found themselves in the European theater in France. And it occurred to me that many of them that this language that they were told wasn't even real French and it was worthless worked just fine. Especially when talking to French peasants and ordinary people in the marketplace and trying to get a date with this pretty girl or get a bottle of wine or a dry place to sleep. And their superiors noticed this right away. You know, these people can speak to the natives. And so they became interpreters.
World War II had a huge impact on Cajun society, and I'd say it's one of the three most important events in the entire sweep of Acadian history from 1604 to the present. First of all, you had all Cajun males from the ages of 18 to 36 being susceptible to the draft, so they were being picked up by Uncle Sam and being sent to camps and God knows where for basic training, and there no one spoke French. They were expected to speak English. Maybe some of these guys had never been away from their hometowns before or past the parish line. So all of a sudden they're immersed in this English-speaking world, and they had to learn to speak English in order to stay alive.
These GIs who came back home after World War II, they were the ones who were populating the bars and the dance halls, trying to dance and drink and forget their troubles. What they wanted was to hear traditional Cajun music, and they wanted to be home, and they wanted to have their traditional... And they're the ones who said, you know what? This language they told us wasn't real French works. And they began to reconsider the whole thing. In fact, if there was a nationalistic movement associated with World War I, there was a sort of a regional movement associated with the end of World War II. This is when the Newport Folk Festival was developed. There was a celebration, a search for diversity in America. We became, as a country, afraid of all looking alike and sounding alike and being alike. And so we began to explore our own diversity. In that exploration, in the 50s and 60s, the Cajuns played a major part. The Cajuns were invited to the 1964 Newport Folk Festival. Dewey Balfa and Gladys Thibodeau and Vinus Lejeune went up there. And the feeling here was that they were going up there to get laughed at. But when they got up there, they were considered instead heroes of cultural preservation as early as the late 40s, in fact. Even before the Newport Folk Festival, you had people like Ira Lejeune, Lawrence Walker, Aldous Roger, Austin Peete, Dewey Balfa, people like that leading a reconsideration of what was valuable in the culture and by association in the language.
While the musicians waged a war of resistance on stage, others were taking up the fight on other fronts. Politician and activist Jimmy DeMongeau founded the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, Codefil, with a radical new mission now written into state law.
The Council for the Development of French in Louisiana had in the early going, had a very elitist approach to things. It was saving French from the top down with schools and with, social clubs and that kind of thing. Whereas there was a grassroots surge that was looking to happen. And it happened under the leadership of musicians. It was in 1974 that we put together the first Cajun Music Festival. It was the first expression of grassroots support, this surge of cultural, social power that came up from the bottom and said, we are concerned about this. We're interested in this. This is important to us. And it was celebrated with music. And it continued to be celebrated with music through things like festivals and Dewey Balfour's Folk Artists in the Schools program. And eventually, Codeville married the two. Jimmy DiMaggio, the president of Codeville, was very perceptive. He noticed that language doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't just preserve French. You have to preserve something to do in French. French has to make you laugh and dance and cry, and it has to be part of your life. So this cultural movement emerged alongside this linguistic educational movement.
French immersion in Louisiana is based on the Canadian model. The Canadians have been doing French immersion since the 60s, when Anglophone Canadians realized that their children would be at a disadvantage. They couldn't get federal jobs if they weren't bilingual the way most French-speaking Canadians were. And so it's a matter of economics there. In Louisiana, the movement was spurred by parents of that lost generation, parents whose parents did not speak French to them.
While it's not true that Cajun French is so different from what we call French that it's another language, it also is true that it has its own particularities and its own vocabulary, word choice, syntax style. And it's important, I think, to, as we work to preserve French Louisiana, that we remember that what we're trying to preserve here is the way people here speak, and the way, because it's this language that produced Cajun music and the stories and you know, the way people think about things. We can't just import university French from France or Belgium or Quebec or anywhere else. I think we have to be very careful to incorporate the way people speak here, and we have to respect that.
Comment s'appelle celui qui joue l'accordéon là?
Philippe.
Philippe? Oui, c'est pas David. Ouais. Il est pas à l'entour, tu crois?
Oh, peut-être.
Peut-être. On va aller voir
Je
tout à
pense
l'heure.
qu'il est il est dans le bateau.
Ah, il est dans le bateau. Ok,
Oui.
ouais. On va aller dans le bateau tout à l'heure, nous autres même. On va faire la chanson peut-être encore une fois. Hein? Belle Louisiane, c'est bon pour vous? Vas-y. Belle Louisiane,
Is it possible to say French in Louisiana? Absolutely.
Est-ce que le livre est sur la table?
Our last and best hope, and that is the immersion program, because it's the only thing that actually teaches the kids, gets the kids to actually speak the language, to live in the language.
Et sous la table? Très bien.
Yes, it is possible. Damn right it's possible.